Folks, first off, I want to thank everybody for coming out. My name is Brandon Carter. I'm a member of the American Civil War Museum. This talk is on behalf of the Tredegar Society. I want to thank the law firm of Hunt & Williams, Richmond law firm, which so kindly gives us the funds to allow us to bring in wonderful speakers like Dr. Richard McMurray, a native of Atlanta, received his undergraduate degree from the Virginia Military Institute. He then served, there's a couple of those guys out there today. He then served in the United States Army. Afterwards, he earned his master's and PhD from Emory University under the great historian Bell Wiley. Dr. McMurray has taught at Valdosta State University and North Carolina State University. He is the author of numerous award-winning books and articles on the Civil War, including Two Great Rebel Armies, an essay in Confederate military history, John Bell Hood and the War for Southern Independence, Atlanta, 1864, Last Chance for the Confederacy, and Virginia Military Institute alumni in the Civil War from the Virginia Battles and Leaders series. The Cincinnati Civil War Roundtable noted that Dr. McMurray is considered among current historians to be the foremost supporter of the importance of the Western theater to the outcome of the Civil War. Dr. McMurray currently resides in Dalton, Georgia, in the heart of his Atlanta battlefields, and tonight we're going to ask him to shift his focus from the Western theater to his alma mater at VMI. So without further ado, Dr. Richard McMurray.
Forget the doctor crap. I'm glad to get the opportunity to come back to Richmond. It's the first time I've had a chance to get back here in, probably 12, 15 years. Spent a lot of time here when I was working on this book about VMI. I'll tell you a little bit about that as we go along, because I wanted to track down the VMI alumni and what they did during the Civil War. And as you can imagine, there's a lot of information about them in the Virginia State Library and in the Confederate Service Records. But I'll get to that a little bit later. As I say, it's good to be back here, get to see some old friends whom I have not seen in quite a while, and to make some new friends like this brand new rat-like cadet here who keeps using the word doctor, despite the fact that I told him not to. I think it's terrible taste. But anyway, Brandon asked me to come up here and talk about the Virginia Military Institute in the Civil War. And I thought, going over this, there are one or two seats up here if you want to come in, and there's one here and one over here. Actually, there are two over here. Well, I'll sit down while I'm talking, and then there'll only be one over here. But I thought what I would do is talk a little bit about the background of the school, what it was intended to do, what I think it did, and then talk about what I think is the real significant role of VMI in the Civil War and how I happen to come to think about it. And I hope by the time I get through, I will have given you a little something that you can think about in trying to understand the war, and that what I have to say will help you come to some sort of grasp and understanding what is still and probably always will be the most important single event in American history. The American Civil War, what it did, why it did it, how it had the outcome that it had, why it took the shape that it did. And I think VMI played a role in that. And I hope that when I get through with all of this, as I say, that I will have given you something to think about. But I want to begin with a little background on the school. There's some VMI people here. You already know most of this, probably all of it. Some of you probably know more than I do, which is not strange at all, and is not limited to VMI subjects. But give you a little background on the school for those of you who don't know much about it, and then get on into the role of VMI in the Civil War. But to understand what happened with VMI in the Civil War and the role of VMI in the Civil War, you've got to go back to how American military forces were raised before the 20th century. It was quite different from the way that the United States would raise an army today. If the United States went to war today, the federal government would undertake the task of raising the U.S. Army. It was not that way before the 20th century. Before then, if the United States went to war, the states would raise the troops. The federal government War Department, we were more honest then. We called it a War Department. Today we call it a Defense Department. But the War Department would sit down with the census returns, look at the military age population, 18 to 35, by state, and they would assign each state a quota. And the War Department would contact the governor of the state. We want to raise this many troops from your state, that many troops from the other state. That was how the U.S. raised its military forces. It was how the Confederacy raised most of its military forces. So when the War of 1812 began, troops were raised by the individual states, raised, organized, officered, and equipped by the state governments. Then, once that was done, the state turned the troops over to the federal authorities, and they became part of the U.S. Army. They retained their state identification in the federal service. And then when the war ended, these troops were, in effect, sent back to the states. And the state disbanded them and sent them back home. That was how the War of 1812 worked. The state of Virginia had a quota of troops to raise for the War of 1812. It provided weapons, other equipment for them. And when the war ended, these troops came back to the various areas in Virginia from which they had come. They turned their equipment over to the state authorities, and they went back to their farms and their shops. Here's suddenly the state of Virginia with this huge pile of military equipment. What are we going to do with it? And we can't just let it sit here in the open. We could sell it, but we'd take a big loss. And who knows, there might be another war in 2 years, and we just have to buy more of it. We need to build a place to preserve it. So the state legislature kicked this around, and a year or two after the war ended in 1815, the state of Virginia, the legislature, voted to create 3 state arsenals in which this surplus military equipment could be stored. One of them was to be over here in the eastern part of the state in Richmond. The other one was to be way out here in what is now West Virginia. The third one was to be in the middle part of the state. And for, I'm sure, political pork reasons, they picked Rockbridge County in general and Lexington in particular. Now, the one in Richmond was built. The one in West Virginia was never built. The one in Lexington was built and started operations in 1819. The local authorities in Lexington said, put it on this high bluff, way out on the northeastern part of town. You don't want a facility in town where you have tons of gunpowder. Put it way out on the northeastern section of town on this bluff beyond Washington College. If it blows up Washington College, it won't matter much, but put it way out there so that it won't damage Lexington if it explodes, if you get a fire. And that's what they decided to do. They built the arsenal out there on that bluff beyond Washington College. It was a convenient place. You could bring the weapons up the rivers, up the James River and what was then called the North River. It's now called the Murray River. You could bring them up by boat and transfer them to the arsenal. They built the structures for the arsenal, brought the weapons up, and stored them in the buildings. Now, you can't just let thousands of weapons, excuse me, there's seats up here if you want. Okay. I just hate to see a pretty lady stand up. Of course, so many pretty ladies have stood me up, I guess I shouldn't complain about it. Truth be told, some ugly ladies have stood me up too. But they brought the weapons up to store them in this arsenal. And you don't want to just have them sit there. You know, people would sneak in and steal them, or you've got to protect them. So to protect them, the state of Virginia recruited what came to be called the Public Guard. This was a state military force. 20 to 30 men, depending on how many were there. They would enlist in the State Guard for 5 years, later changed to 3. In effect, they constituted a state military/police force to guard the arsenal. The problem was that there was really no threat to the arsenal. You know, the Indians are not going to be a problem. Nobody's going to make a serious attempt to steal this stuff, but you still have to have a guard on it. And most of the time, the guard personnel, they were getting bored. You know, what do? You get out there and maybe 3 hours a day you walk a guard post to protect the arsenal. The rest of the time you lounge around, you gamble with the other members of the State Guard, you get drunk, you go into town, you cause problems, you fight with the students at Washington College. There are all kinds of problems with this. As one person in Lexington said, the State Guard is a discordant element in our community. And it certainly was. And after a while, it dawned on the good people of Lexington, we've got to do something about this. They were in a dilemma. They did not want to close the arsenal because the arsenal brought government money into Lexington. We call this port today. They didn't use the term then. But the state was spending $6,000 or $7,000 a year to run that arsenal, and that money was pouring into Rockbridge County. So we don't want to close the arsenal. What are we going to do? And there was a lot of discussion of this in Lexington. The town had some debating societies and civic leaders and people like that, and they began to talk about this arsenal. What are we going to do with this? And somebody, we don't know who, and we will never know who, but somebody came up with the idea. If we made that a college, we could use the college students to guard the weapons in the arsenal. There was some talk for a while about get the Washington College students to do it. But Washington College said, no, we don't want anything to do with it because that would mean we might be subject to government control if we get involved with the government. This is a private institution. Well, it's not going to be Washington College, it's got to be something else. And out of this long discussion by 1825 or 1830, emerged the idea that we will convert the arsenal to a state school, and the students at the school will, in addition to their academic work, will serve as guards for the public arsenal. They will protect the thousands of weapons, the tons of gunpowder, and the other military equipment stored there. The man who had more to do with this than anybody else was a local citizen named John Thomas Lewis Preston. How many of you have been to VMI? You remember the sunken garden down there with the statue of the naked youth in it and plaques, and it's called Memorial Garden. And if you're there in Memorial Garden and face barracks, there's this wall called a parapet. And you're grinning. And on the wall, because you know what's coming, on the wall there's an inscription from John Thomas Lewis Preston describing the Institute. And one of the first things you have to do when you are there your first year is memorize it, because you never know when some upperclassman is going to want to be inspired by hearing the inscription on the wall. And it's particularly in the first month or so of going around the post, you will hear upperclassmen, "Whoa, Rat, what's the inscription on the parapet?" "Sir, the inscription on the parapet, the healthful and pleasant abode of a crowd of honorable youth pressing up the hill of Sion." You know, you've memorized the whole thing. And then it ends JTL Preston, and it's inevitably, what does JTL stand for, Rat? John Thomas Lewis, sir. Drive on, Rat. You do that. John Thomas Lewis Preston was, if anybody's the founding father of VMI, it was Preston, but he specifically said that the idea did not originate with him. So, as I say, we'll never know with whom the idea originated. But he had more to do with shaping it than anybody else, including bestowing a name on it. Virginia, a state institution, not national, not a religious denomination, which most schools then were. Military, which he called its characteristic feature, and institute. something that was not a college or a university. It was a third thing, something else. Anyway, they kicked this idea around. The idea developed. Finally, they got legislation through the state assembly to convert the arsenal to the Virginia Military Institute. To be run by a board of visitors, people who would kind of oversee it like a board of directors. And the board of visitors would set policy. They picked a superintendent, Francis H. Smith. We have a descendant of Francis Smith here this evening, so if you want to know about Francis Smith, I refer you back here. Francis Henry Smith, a West Point graduate from Norfolk, if I remember that correctly, from down somewhere in eastern Virginia. West Point graduate, and they hired him to be the first principal professor, as they called it. Later it changed to the superintendent. And Smith and the Board of Visitors, in working out the plan for it, decided that they would base the school on the United States Military Academy, because Smith and so many others were part of that. Began operations in November 11th, 1839, when the 1st Cadet Sentinel relieved the last of the public guards. And the 1st Cadet Sentinel's name is, aha! A rat who doesn't know who the 1st Cadet Sentinel was.
Strange.
Okay, close enough. John Boy Strange was the 1st cadet. That's another thing you have to know. You know, he relieved the old guard there from the arsenal, and the cadets in the institute began their work. There was a struggle at first, like it was with many schools, and all of the cadets who came there to start with were people who came from the state of Virginia. The school, as Preston had indicated, the school was quite different from a lot of schools in the United States, particularly in two important ways. Most colleges and universities that existed in the United States at that time stressed the classics. In fact, to get admitted to most colleges and universities, you had to know Greek and Latin. You know, that's to start with. And then you go on from there to study the classics. Smith decided that VMI would not be that kind of school. It would instead do what the United States Military Academy did, which was to stress engineering, mathematics, modern foreign languages. If they'd had the term then, they would have said VMI is going to be a STEM school. Science, technology, engineering, mathematics. You know, that's the big thing in education now, be a STEM school. And VMI would be much more that way than any other way. It would give beginning with basic instruction in mathematics the first year. They would teach foreign languages. It would be French, because French was regarded as the great military language of the 1800s. This was owing to the great Napoleon. You know, everybody thought because of Napoleon, the French were great military people. That lasted until the Franco-Prussian War, when armies all over the world started wearing spiked helmets and marching around like that. You think I'm kidding? Go back and look at U.S. Army uniforms in the 1880s sometime. But the French was the foreign language that they taught. They taught mathematics. The other thing that would be different about it would be the military training. The students, when they were not going to class or studying, would undergo various kinds of military training. And the school grew very gradually through the 1840s and 50s up to the time of the Civil War. Let me give you just some numbers here. I normally hate to do this, but I think it illustrates the point that I'm going to try to make. If you take the first classes at VMI, 1842, because originally, remember, they started in 1830. Originally, it was a 3-year curriculum. And take the first 3 classes, 1842, 43, 44, they averaged 28.7 members. And they graduated 12.7. Not even half. 1845 to 49, the late 1840s, class size increased to an average of 34.6, and number of graduates to 18.8. In the early 1850s, the class size, the entering class size, had grown to 43.6, and there were 21.8 graduates, or 22 in round numbers. In the late 1850s, the entering classes numbered at the entrance 58, and on average, they graduated 24. So the school is growing. It's not big by modern standards, but by the standards of the mid-19th century, it is big. The largest antebellum class was the class of 1860, which had 83 people enter. Remember, by this time, it's building up to the Civil War. And you've had Bleeding Kansas and the Kansas-Nebraska Act, and you're on the eve of the Dred Scott decision and all these other problems. People are looking towards some kind of sectional struggle, and there's an influx of folks. So you get 83 members in the class of 1860 with 41 graduates. The school is growing. I want to talk a little bit, before we talk about the role in the war, about the way the Confederates lived, the cadets lived, what they did, because this is the point that I'm going to try to emphasize in a little while. The Cadets' Day was regulated, and it was regulated from the first day that they were there. New cadets entered the school usually within a few days the week after July 4th. And for 6 or 8 weeks, they lived in tents outside of the barracks building, which was built beginning in 1850, tore down the arsenal. They lived in tents. They learned the basics of being a soldier, the manual of arms, close order drill, how to handle weapons, things like that. I think this is extremely important, because this means that even if you stayed at VMI only a short time, you learned the basics of being a soldier. The average person stayed at VMI, more than 95% of them, stayed at VMI at least 6 months, which means that you went through this beginning period of mastering the basics of being a soldier. And in many times, the new cadets, who eventually came to be called rats, were instructed and taught by the old cadets. This too is important, because it means the old cadets are teaching the new cadets. They are teachers. Many of the cadets, in fact, were what are called state cadets. They paid a very small sum of money to come to VMI. The state picked up most of their costs. And in return for that, the state cadets owed the state service for a certain number of years. Most of the time, it was 2 years, and most of them satisfied the requirement for teaching, or by teaching. VMI was not a teacher's school, but a lot of the people who went to VMI wind up teaching. They teach the new cadets basic stuff, then some of them go out and teach in the public schools. That's crucial for reasons that I will get to in a little while. Also, we need to note that when these cadets came to VMI in July, they came from all across the state of Virginia. Smith was a very good politician. You know, anybody in academic administration at a public school has to be a politician, which means you have to work with political people in the state government. And if you've got a county way down here in southwestern Virginia that is totally insignificant in the state economy, but the representative from that county is the chairman of the Appropriations Committee in the state legislature, that county is important. I remember when I was at Fort Campbell one time, we had all these reserve units that were called up for the Berlin Wall crisis. I mean, we had 20,000 reserve units there. Most of them were big things like monster engineer battalions and things that supported the 101st Airborne Division. We had about a 6-man weather detachment from the Delaware National Guard. Whoever the senator was from Delaware was very important in Army appropriations. And the governor of Delaware once came out there to visit Fort Campbell, to visit these 6 guys who were out there in the Delaware Weather Observe Unit or whatever it was. And man, the instructions came out, the governor of Delaware would be here. If the governor should stop you and ask you, where are you from, soldier? You say, Delaware, sir. I have this vision of the governor walking across Fort Campbell. Where are you from, soldier? Delaware, sir. Where are you from, soldier? Delaware, sir. Where are you from, soldier? Delaware, sir. Everybody's from Delaware. These people just will not get it through their heads, that when you start faking stuff like that, it becomes rather obvious. I remember one time when I was at VMI, they took the first class on a visit to Quantico, the Marine base, and they had a dinner for us, and I believe it was Lemuel Shepard, former Commandant of the Marine Corps, and VMI alumnus who came to speak, and they were instructing us. They said, now when the general says something, it's customary to applaud. I had this vision. Please pass the salt. No, the salt. Damn it, pass the salt. Standing ovation. How'd we get off? Oh, Francis Smith. He's got people from all across the state of Virginia. That's important. It's important that the old cadets instruct the new cadets, and it's important that a lot of the cadets, when they finish, go teach in schools for at least a couple of years. We'll get back to that later. So the school grew. It added more courses, advanced courses in sciences, advanced courses in mathematics. Ultimately, they put in courses in Latin, not only for its own value, but also because a lot of the people going out to teach in the public schools would deal with students who had to know Latin to get into other schools. So you had to have Latin instruction there. The school expanded, the curriculum expanded, the faculty expanded, the number of cadets expanded. The school was doing very well. By the time the Civil War came, VMI was widely recognized within the state. As you probably know, in 1859, when John Brown staged his raid on Harper's Ferry, the state of Virginia ordered the Corps of Cadets to go to Harper's Ferry to stand as part of the Guard once Brown had been tried and was being executed for treason against the state of Virginia. They went up and did that. They came back to VMI. Then in April of 1861, when Virginia seceded, Smith, again thinking like the politician that he was, contacted the governor of Virginia and said, the Virginia Military Institute and the Corps of Cadets is at your service. So the order came down, send the Corps to Richmond, where they will serve as drill masters, instructing raw recruits in drill, the manual of arms, handling weapons, small unit tactics. So you've got this group of people that go marching off with Professor Thomas J. Jackson. If you know about VMI, you know Thomas J. Jackson was on the faculty there in the 1850s, taught natural and experimental philosophy, which today we call physics. And Jackson, Smith said, was the absolute worst teacher in the history of the Institute. His method of teaching was to memorize and recite the textbook. And if a student said, sir, I don't understand that, he would back up and recite it again. But he was not the worst teacher in the history of the Institute. He was the second worst. I'm not going to tell you who the first one was, because he might still be alive. Although, truth be told, I devoutly hope not. I don't want to have to go back and take that course again. But Jackson took them off to Richmond. They instructed recruits in Richmond, Camp Lee here. Jackson himself was soon sent off to Harper's Ferry, and at the end of 2 or 3 months of instructing recruits, the Corps went home. Most of them went home and enlisted in the Confederate Army and went into military service. VMI closed down. It was closed that fall. But Smith, most of the faculty, virtually all the cadets were off in military service. All the weapons in the arsenal there were issued to the troops. For a while in the summer, they trained people in what was called the class of 1864 MS, military science, sort of an officer candidate school. People who came there, including, incidentally, one guy from the Citadel. I tell my Citadel people, you know, this poor guy was at the Citadel and they still had to send him to VMI to teach him what to do. But when they left, they essentially closed down the school. And there was some talk about, you know, leave it closed or whatever. But the Confederate War Department realized or recognized the value of the school. They reopened early in 1862 and stayed open throughout the war. And during the war, VMI continued to accept large numbers of students. In fact, they were going into the hundreds in some of the classes during the war. Very few of them stuck around to graduate. So it was not unusual to have something like the class of 1867, which might have 280 members, of whom 12 would eventually graduate. And most of those graduated when they came back after the war. Guys would come to VMI, they would be there for 4 or 5 months, 6 months, go into military service. Some of them would come back after the war. The Corps of Cadets during the war was part of the military force of Virginia. And on several occasions, the Corps was called out to participate in this or that military operation. They marched to McDowell in 1862 to support Stonewall Jackson. They were called out several times in 1863 when there were threats of cavalry raids. And of course, one of the things that everybody knows about VMI and the Civil War is that on May 15, 1864, at the Battle of Newmarket, the Corps of Cadets defeated an invading Union army and chased it back down the Shenandoah. Well, I have to, truth be told, they had a little help from some Confederate Army units that were in the neighborhood. But VMI participated in the battle at Newmarket. Later that summer, Federal forces occupied Lexington, fired cannonballs at VMI. There's still what are purported to be 3 or 4 of them embedded on the backside of barracks. You can go around there near the Jonathan Daniels Pavilion and look up, and way up near the top you see these what look like metal balls embedded in the side of barracks. Supposedly the cannonball. There's cynics who think the cannonballs fell out years ago and that these are replacements that they have put up there for them. But at any rate, that's the story they tell. Federal forces, when they occupied Lexington, burned VMI. Smith dismissed the Corps with orders to listen for instructions. Later, the Corps, the Institute, moved to Richmond. It was here in Richmond the last 5 or 6 months of the war, attending classes, being called out to man parts of the Richmond defense. And in April 1865, as the Confederates were evacuating Richmond, the Corps moved out and occupied part of the trenches around the Richmond defenses so that the veteran Confederate units could move down toward Petersburg and try to stem the breakthrough that the Federal soldiers had managed to effect that day. Afterwards, Smith dismissed the Corps of Cadets with instructions to go home. Many of them went into the Confederate Army. Some of them did go home. Some of them were captured. The Institute, in effect, suspended itself until the fall of 1865. So it's a record where the school during the war participated at many different levels in what the Confederates did. And what I want to do, and again I apologize for reading these numbers to you, but what I want to do is try to give you some idea of the extent to which VMI affected the Civil War and the peculiar circumstances under how it went about its role in the Civil War. If you go to VMI and talk to people there, they like to tell you certain things, like there were 3 Confederate major generals who were VMI alumni: Robert Rhodes, William Mahone, and W.Y.C. Humes, although there's some doubt about whether Humes was ever officially promoted. There were 15 brigadier generals who were VMI alumni. Probably the best known was John McCausland, who burned Chambersburg, Pennsylvania in July 1864. There were 91 colonels. There were 65 lieutenant colonels, 83 majors, 259 captains, 331 lieutenants. And that's in the Confederate Army. There were 19 who served in the Union Army. The total number, including 1 brigadier general, by the way, the total number of people who had enrolled at VMI from 1839 up through the class of 1868, which was the last class, entered early in 1865, but technically in the fall of 1864, was 2,032. And of that number, 1,930 were alive when the war began. 102 had died before the Civil War. 103, for one reason or another, took no part in the Civil War, mostly because they were physically unable to. Some of them were living in Europe. Some of them were ministers. Some of them were the only doctors in their communities. They had to stay there to take care of the people in the community. In summary, 1,827 served in the Civil War, and all but 19 of them in the Confederate service. These people were too few to have made any impression on the war at all if you scattered them out across the Confederacy. If you put an equal number of VMI cadets in every Confederate area, every theater of the war, there are not enough of them to make any difference. But the point is, they were not scattered out. That's the key. They were not scattered out. And that goes back to the way in which Civil War military units were raised. They were raised by the states, often by local people who organized a military company. The call would come down from the governor. We need 5,000 volunteers. And people in some local community would hold a meeting to organize a company. The company they would have a meeting on the public square. People would make speeches. Bands would play. Girls would tell the men in the community, don't ever bother to see us again if you don't enlist. And then they would invite men to enlist. They would join this local unit. And when they joined the unit, they did 2 things. They adopted a name of their company, about a 100-man unit. One of my favorites is a Virginia unit called the Pig River Invincibles. You've got to like the Pig River Invincibles. Second thing they did was to elect their officers and sergeants. If you've ever been in the military, you kind of puzzled by this. Electing a sergeant, that is a problem, because if you're a politician and want to win an election, you have to do one thing, and sergeants do other things. The job of a sergeant is to kick people's behinds and make them do what they don't want to do. The job of a politician is to kiss other people's behinds so they will vote for you. You start electing sergeants, you wear down the discipline. But anyway, that's the way it was done in the 19th century. This was the age of Jacksonian democracy. Then they offered their services to the government, and they went into government service. They were organized into regiments. the Pig River Invincibles became part of the 46th Virginia, and then they went off into the Army. The point of all of this is that because they were organized in local communities, they were local units. They involved people from the town, from the county, from the village. And in almost all areas of Virginia, you had these people who had been to VMI. They weren't across the Confederacy. They were pretty much scattered across Virginia. One of the things Smith did was to make sure that every part of Virginia would have cadets at VMI, so that the political figures in the state legislature from that county would support the Institute. And when these people finished, no matter how long they stayed, they went back home. And they were in the community as farmers, lawyers, editors, doctors, whatever. And when the war came and they organized these local units, the VMI people flocked into the units, which meant that in virtually every Virginia military unit, there was a small cell of what was essentially a chapter of the VMI Alumni Association. That is significant because the job of these local people, the local communities, the low-ranking officers, not the people who became major generals and brigadier generals, but the people who became captains and lieutenants, their job was to teach. Remember who teaches the new cadets the basics of military service? Who teaches in the schools to satisfy the requirements of the state cadets? It's the people at VMI. They are people, they satisfied the absolute first requirement to be a good teacher. The absolute first requirement is you got to know something to teach. If you want to teach chemistry, you got to know chemistry. If you want to teach mathematics, you got to know mathematics. If you want to teach drill in the manual of arms and small unit tactics, you got to know drill in the... I realize this flies in the face of all modern theories of education. But it is true. And what you have, because of the way VMI operated, what you have in virtually every area of Virginia and in every one of these local military units was somebody who could take over at the very beginning and teach these people. And that is the most important job of a junior officer in the Army. They are teachers. They train their troops. And as I said, it helps if you know what you're doing. You can read accounts of Civil War units raised all over the country. Accounts of split-nosed lieutenants who don't know how to handle a saber, or lop-eared captains who cut their own ears off trying to teach somebody how to use a weapon. Officers staying up at night studying the drill manuals, trying to stay a step ahead of the men in their ranks. You know, if you'd gone to a school like VMI, you really didn't need to do that. You know, I think I could still teach somebody how to field strip an M1 rifle. Of course, that'd do them no good since that weapon's no longer used, but, you know, whatever. You learn it and you retain it, and if you learn it and know it and understand it, you can teach it. That's the point. And as I said, if these people had been scattered all across the Confederacy, there would not have been enough of them to make any difference. But they were concentrated in Virginia. And where did the Virginia units, almost all of the Virginia units, wind up? In the Army of Northern Virginia. You know, one of the rare smart things that a government has ever done. The Confederate government did not send Virginia troops to Louisiana to defend New Orleans, while Louisiana troops rushed to Virginia to defend Richmond. You know, they kept the Virginia troops here. They kept most of the Louisiana troops in Louisiana. So you have this concentration of people in the Army of Northern Virginia. Sometimes 40% of the units in the Army of Northern Virginia were from Virginia. And you've got this nucleus of people who know what they're doing and who can teach and train and lead. Now, I don't mean to imply that all the VMI people were brave or gallant. There are a few cases where they were not. Some of them, in fact, were downright disgraceful in what they did while they were in Confederate service. Some of them proved cowardly, not many, but some. Some proved, there was one guy, he wanted to get a commission as a lieutenant, and when the Confederate commission did not come through, he deserted to the Federals. He joined the Federal Army and proved so incompetent that the Federals kicked him out. Now, you can take some comfort perhaps from the fact that he came from what is now West Virginia. But you have Stonewall Jackson did too. Must have been something in the water around Clarksburg. But what you have then is this nucleus of people. I got interested in this because several years ago, in trying to concentrate on the Civil War out in the Mississippi Valley and in the area between the Appalachians and the Mississippi, which is what really interested me, why did the Confederates win battles in Virginia and lose battles everywhere else? And I think one of the basic reasons for it is this nucleus of experienced, knowledgeable, trained people in the Virginia units produced by VMI. And I might add the same thing is true for the South Carolina units. But don't tell anybody from South Carolina, because the Citadel people went into the South Carolina units, and most of those units wound up in Virginia. You know, there's a wonderful book on this called Two Great Rebel Armies, which is one of those books that everybody should buy and read. Truth be told, I don't care if you read it. The same thing also happened in a lot of other states, because by the time of the Civil War, there were military schools, not old ones, but some, in every one of the southern states, from Arkansas to Texas, Louisiana, Mississippi, Florida, the West Florida Institute. Now you call it Florida State University. The Louisiana Seminary of Learning and Military Academy at Pineville. Now Louisiana State University at Baton Rouge. First president of that school was? Sherman, William T. Sherman, every Georgian's favorite Civil War general. I say that actually I like Sherman, but I haven't told many people in Georgia that. I think he's a fascinating fellow. He would tell you what he thought. There was one VMI alumnus who actually studied at VMI and then transferred to the military school at Pineville. And he said he's the only person in the world ever to get instruction in military subjects from Stonewall Jackson and William T. Sherman. So he had a thorough education, I guess we could say, in military matters. Same thing happened, though, with these other states, because when Alabama and Tennessee and Louisiana organized their forces for the war, the people there, VMI alumni, Citadel alumni, the few graduates of the local military schools rushed into military service, became part of the first units organized in Mississippi, Tennessee, Alabama, Louisiana, and those units were sent to Virginia. What I'm getting at again is you get this concentration not just in the Virginia units, but in all the units, or not all of them, but many of them, not just from Virginia, but from the other Confederate states. Even the Texas regiments that served in Virginia had a cadre of people who had been trained at VMI or one of the other military schools. And I'm suggesting that what this did was produce a core of competent, trained leaders at the very beginning of the war. And they were able to teach and train, and their real significance of VMI alumni in the Civil War is not what the VMI alumni did, but what the troops they trained did, because there weren't enough VMI alumni to make that big a difference. But once an alumnus trains a company, you see, you've multiplied his influence by 100 if you've got a full company. And that happened also with a few of the VMI graduates who wound up in the Federal Army. They too fill that same role. And some of the federal comments about our regiment is superbly drilled and we owe it to so-and-so who graduated from the Virginia Military Institute. You know, there's just no substitute for knowledge, particularly if you want to teach. So overall, it's an inspiring record, and I think it illustrates very well what VMI was intended to do. It was not a school that was created to teach people or train people for professional military service. There were only a couple of dozen or so VMI people who went into professional military service up through the Civil War. Most of them came from rural areas, small towns, cities like Richmond, Norfolk, Alexandria, went to VMI, went back to their communities, became doctors, lawyers, clergymen, editors, merchants. When the Civil War started, they were there to teach. And they went into these local units. And that, I think, goes a long way to explain why the Confederate Army enjoyed a great deal of success in the Virginia area and not in other areas. So I hope this will give you something to think about, folks. When you study this, if you read regimental histories, try to find out if there's anybody in the regiment who had some military experience and who could teach, because that's the most important thing that these people did. Thank you very much, folks.
First off, thank you so much, Richard. With your permission, there is some time for questions if you'd be willing to field a few.
Okay, yes, ma'am.
The age of the entering cadets.
The age of the entering cadets. It varied substantially. Most of them would have been 16, 17, some much younger than that, some as young as 14. Particularly during the war, they would have some older ones in their early 20s. They even had one in the class of 1864 military science, MS, who was married. He's the only person who's ever been to VMI when the school knew he was married. Yes, sir. Yes. The question was there anything among the VMI people akin to the sort of rivalry that you had between West Point classmates, one of whom was in the Confederate Army, like Thomas Rosser or Joe Wheeler, and the other one of whom was in the Union Army, like George Custer or Judson Kilpatrick? Not to my knowledge, and I doubt very seriously if there would have been, because most of them were not high enough in the military hierarchy to get involved in that kind of thing. I mentioned that one of the Union VMI alumni was a general. He was a brigadier general in the District of Columbia militia. And there were a couple of others, but to my knowledge, there was nothing like that kind of rivalry from the VMI people. Other questions? Yes, sir.
So you said approximately 1,000 people from the...
Go Georgia Tech, yes?
Do you have any idea how many of those people made it to the end of the war?
How many of them what?
Made it to the end of the war?
Yes, I'll get that for you while I'm going back here. Question was, how many of these people survived the war? Other questions while I'm walking over here to look this up? Yes, sir. The question essentially is the Northern armies having people like this as opposed to the Confederate Army, and the South being more militant. Yes, there is a school of historical thought that traces the militancy in Southern society, not just in the Civil War. The classic book in this is one by John Hope Franklin, published in the late 1940s, called The Militant South. And it grows out of the fact that much more so than places like even Ohio and Illinois, Southern states remain frontier states with possible danger from the Indians. Southern states faced the possibility of a slave insurrection, and so they needed a military force to put that down. Dueling was much more characteristic and customary in the South, even though it was illegal. It was a much more militant society. This is, I think, what you're kind of getting at. And that led a lot of these people that way. Plus the fact that in Northern society, there were a lot more opportunities in engineering, banking, maritime activities, large-scale farming and that kind of thing, so that northern people growing up had many more options than people in the South did. Does that answer your question? Okay, 435 alumni, including some of those who were later, and in other instances, killed, mortally wounded, or died of, well, wait a minute, I'm skipping here. 171 alumni were known to have been killed or mortally wounded, and another 435 to have been wounded, killed, known or believed to have been wounded, including Randolph J. Barton, class of 1864, who was wounded 12 times. It's a bullet magnet in the Civil War. There are a number of them who took multiple wounds. 326 were captured during the war, most of them at Gettysburg. Pickett's division was infested with VMI alumni. Many of them at Spotsylvania, many of them at Sailor's Creek. Does that answer your question? And Go Jackets. Yes, sir.
How was the development of the Citadel similar or different than VMI?
Well, everybody knows the Citadel is way down here. The VMI is way up here. Citadel is about, I forget, 5 or 6 years after VMI. And it actually ran as two schools, what they call, I believe, the Arsenal in Columbia and the Citadel itself in Charleston. And it's the one in Charleston that survived, that we know about. You can go there to Charleston and the old Citadel building there at, what is that square, Calhoun Square? Painted pink last time I was there. I don't know if that was in anticipation of the admission of women to the Citadel or what, but they painted these old buildings pink. That's the old Citadel. The new Citadel's out of town a ways. Essentially, it was the same thing. Same kind of curriculum, same kind of faculty. It was just a bit smaller, and probably a much greater percentage of Citadel alumni moved out of South Carolina. So that you would, if you went to Mississippi or Alabama, you would find a larger contingent of Citadel people living there at the beginning of the war than you would find of VMI people. I knew a guy once who was working on a book similar to this that I wrote on the Citadel, and I've never seen anything he did with it. So I don't know what the status of that. I kept waiting for it. But essentially it's the same thing on a smaller scale. Yes, sir? How would I define its mission today and its potential influence today? The mission is essentially the same: to take people to train them for positions of leadership and use military methods to do so. That's what sets VMI apart. You know, it's the use of military methods, not the academic curriculum, which I think is probably a bit stronger than the curriculum at a great many other schools, because VMI does not have what I call crap majors, community recreation and that kind of thing that you find at so many. You wonder why VMI does so poorly in football. But it has a very strong academic program. U.S. News and World Report, back when it used to be a legitimate magazine, would rank, I mean a real magazine, not a legitimate magazine, would rank American colleges and universities. And for about the last 8 or 9 years that they did that, except for the last 3 years, the best, U.S. News rated the best undergraduate liberal arts school, public school in the country was VMI. And then they decided to count the 3 service academies, and so VMI got bumped down to number 3 after the Naval Academy and the Military Academy. I think it's a damning comment on American education when the 3 best liberal arts schools in the country are the Naval Academy, the Military Academy, and VMI. But don't get me off on that. Good Lord. Other questions? Yes.
You mentioned that the Arsenal was disbanded in 1850. Did you say that?
No. The arsenal was converted to the school the official date was 1839.
Right.
When the arsenal ceased to exist and the school took its place. There was an arsenal guy, public guard, walking his sentinel post out there on November 11th, and John Bowie Strange walked up and said, "I'm the new sentinel, you're relieved."
But I mean, but did they still have all the gunpowder and everything else?
Yes,
They were there
they
going
did until the Civil War. Then they, on orders from Richmond, they would issue the gunpowder and the weapons and the other equipment to Virginia troops. A number of the weapons and a lot of the gunpowder were taken to Harper's Ferry. You remember Jackson took the cadets to Richmond. Then Jackson was sent to Harper's Ferry, and he said, "I need weapons, I need gunpowder." And so they sent the word to VMI, ship X number of weapons, so many tons of gunpowder. And Preston, who was there, Smith was off with the state government. Preston detailed about a dozen cadets to go along with this stuff and to come back after they'd turned it over to Jackson. And Jackson kidnapped them. He wanted them as drill masters at Harper's Ferry. He wouldn't let them go back to Lexington. And they were happy. They did. Who wants to go back and study calculus and analytical geometry when you can be out playing soldier? So it worked out well. But yes, the arsenal became the institute, but the weapons were still there. And if you're familiar with the VMI post, you've been there, you remember that where that statue of George Washington is, facing what's Washington Arch on the south side of Barracks. The south side of Barracks is essentially where the Arsenal building was. And it was torn down in the 1840s. It was too small, was torn down. There is a model of it in the VMI Museum of the Arsenal building. So if you haven't seen it, it was there a couple of weeks ago. It was not there the last time I was there several years ago. So if you haven't been there in several years, next time you're up there, you might want to take a look at it.
We have time for one more. If anyone has one last one to throw at Richard.
Okay, thank you very much, folks.